The ceremony hall fell silent as Sergeant Major Brennan's hand connected with Irene Hill's shoulder, shoving her backward off the stage. 200 uniformed personnel watched in shock as the young European lieutenant stumbled, her medals clinking against her chest. But what happened next would change military protocol forever. Because when a four-star general rose from his seat, it wasn't to reprimand the fallen officer. It was to render the sharpest salute anyone in that room had ever witnessed. This is the story of how the woman they called too emotional became the soldier they'd never forget. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. Lieutenant Irene Hill had learned to make herself invisible. At 26 years old, she'd spent 3 years at Forward Operating Base Sentinel in Eastern Europe, and she'd mastered the art of occupying space without drawing attention. It wasn't that she was shy, far from it. Irene possessed a fire that burned bright and hot, the kind of passion that made her voice shake when she spoke about things that mattered. And that, according to her superiors, was precisely the problem. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of the communications center where Irene worked her usual 12-hour shift. Around her, radio operators cycled through frequencies, intelligence analysts pored over satellite imagery, and logistics coordinators managed supply chains that kept the base operational. Irene did all of these jobs and more, often simultaneously, her fingers flying across keyboards as she translated intercepted communications from 4 different languages. But when briefings happened, when decisions were made, when operations were planned, Irene Hill was never in the room. She was too emotional, they said. Too passionate. Too likely to let her feelings interfere with objective military judgment. The fact that her translations had prevented 3 terrorist attacks and her analysis had saved countless lives seemed irrelevant when weighed against the cardinal sin of caring too much. Sergeant Major Victor Brennan made sure she understood her place. He was a 28-year veteran with a chest full of medals and a personality like broken glass, sharp, cold, and capable of drawing blood with the slightest contact. Brennan ran the operations division with an iron fist, and he'd decided from day one that Irene represented everything wrong with modern military standards. Hill, his voice cut through the communications center like a blade through butter. Irene looked up from her workstation where she'd been cross-referencing communications patterns with known hostile activity. Yes, Sergeant Major? This analysis you submitted about the supply route vulnerabilities. He dropped a thick folder on her desk with enough force to rattle her coffee cup. It's speculative garbage. We deal in facts here, not feelings. Irene's jaw tightened. She'd spent 6 weeks building that analysis, correlating data from dozens of sources, identifying patterns that suggested enemy forces were planning to ambush supply convoys along Route 7. Sergeant Major, the pattern correlation is 93%. I don't care if it's 99%, Hill. You're making emotional leaps based on insufficient data. This is exactly why analysts like you don't make operational decisions. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that only she could hear. You feel things too much. You get attached to your theories. Real soldiers trust evidence, not intuition. Around the communications center, her colleagues suddenly found their workstations fascinating. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody spoke up. They'd all learned that defending Irene Hill meant painting a target on your own back, and most weren't willing to take that risk. After Brennan walked away, Irene sat staring at her analysis. Every data point was solid. Every correlation was verified. But she'd made the mistake of including a section about the human cost of ignoring the threat, the soldiers who would die if her warnings went unheeded. That emotional appeal had damned the entire report in Brennan's eyes. Captain Elena Frost approached Irene's station an hour later, her expression sympathetic but cautious. Elena was one of the few officers who treated Irene with respect, though even she had to be careful about it. Don't let Brennan get to you, Elena said quietly. Your work is solid. Solid doesn't matter if nobody listens, Irene replied, her accent thickening the way it always did when emotions ran high. She was from a small village in the Italian Alps, a place where passion and expressiveness were valued, not condemned. the transition to military stoicism had never quite taken. "They listen more than you think," Elena assured her. "Your last 3 reports?" "Command implemented every recommendation, even if they didn't acknowledge it publicly." "Brennan hates that you're right so often." Irene wanted to believe her, but 3 years of systematic dismissal had worn grooves of doubt into her confidence. She was good at her job, exceptional, even. But being good wasn't enough when the system had decided you were fundamentally flawed. That evening, as Irene walked back to her quarters through the base's main square, she passed the memorial wall where photographs of fallen soldiers reminded everyone what they were fighting for. She stopped, as she always did, in front of a picture of Private Danny Webb, a young soldier from Manchester who'd died in an ambush 3 months earlier. An ambush that Irene had predicted but couldn't convince anyone to take seriously until it was too late. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the photograph, her eyes burning with tears she wouldn't let fall. "Not here. Not where someone might see and confirm every stereotype about emotional female soldiers." She'd learned to save her tears for the shower, where running water masked the sound of grief. What Irene didn't know was that someone was watching. Colonel James Hendricks stood in the shadows near the administration building, observing the young lieutenant's nightly ritual at the memorial wall. He'd been watching Irene Hill for months, reading every report she filed, every analysis she submitted. And he'd been building a file of his own, one that told a very different story than the one Sergeant Major Brennan was writing. Back in her quarters, Irene opened her personal laptop and continued the project she'd been working on for 8 months. Using her off-duty hours, she'd been developing a predictive algorithm that analyzed communication patterns, supply movements, weather conditions, and historical attack data to forecast hostile activity with unprecedented accuracy. The program was sophisticated, drawing on her linguistic expertise, analytical skills, and yes, her intuition about human behavior. Nobody knew about the algorithm. Nobody knew that Irene spent her nights refining code and testing variables. And nobody knew that her emotional approach to intelligence gathering, the way she tried to understand the psychology and motivations of enemy forces, was actually producing insights that cold data analysis missed. She called the program Sentinel, after the base where she developed it. It was nearly complete, just a few more weeks of testing before it would be ready to present. If anyone would listen. If anyone could look past the passionate young woman and see the brilliant analyst she'd become. As Irene worked into the early morning hours, her fingers dancing across the keyboard, she had no way of knowing that everything was about to change. That in 72 hours, her algorithm would detect a threat so significant that ignoring it would be impossible. And that the confrontation with Sergeant Major Brennan would finally force the military establishment to decide whether their prejudices were worth more than soldiers' lives. The alert came through at 04:30 on a Tuesday morning, dragging Irene from 3 hours of restless sleep. Her personal laptop was pinging urgently, the Sentinel algorithm she'd been developing flashing red across multiple data streams. She was at her desk in seconds, sleep forgotten as she pulled up the analysis. What she saw made her blood run cold. The algorithm had identified a convergence pattern, enemy communications spiking in 3 different sectors, supply movements that suggested major troop positioning, and weather forecasts indicating optimal conditions for a large-scale coordinated attack. The target appeared to be Forward Operating Base Sentinel itself, and the timeline suggested it would happen within 48 hours. Irene spent the next 2 hours verifying every data point, cross-referencing intelligence from multiple sources, and building the most comprehensive threat assessment she'd ever compiled. The evidence was overwhelming. Someone was planning to hit their base with a force large enough to overwhelm their defenses, and they were planning to do it when most of the combat troops would be deployed on a scheduled patrol operation. By 0700, she had everything documented in a report that she knew would be dismissed the moment she submitted it. Because the algorithm wasn't officially sanctioned. Because her analysis relied partly on behavioral prediction. Because she was Irene Hill, the too emotional lieutenant who let her feelings cloud her judgment. She submitted it anyway, flagging it as urgent and copying it to every officer in the command structure. Then she waited, her stomach churning with anxiety and frustration. Around her, the communications center slowly filled with the day shift, soldiers settling into their routines, unaware that Irene had just predicted an attack that could kill them all. Sergeant Major Brennan arrived at 08:15, and Irene could tell from his expression that he'd read her report. He crossed the communications center with deliberate steps, his face darkening with each stride. Other soldiers instinctively moved out of his way, creating a clear path to Irene's workstation. "Hill." His voice could have frozen nitrogen. "My office. Now." Irene followed him through the maze of corridors to the operations wing, her heart pounding but her spine straight. She'd spent 3 years learning to endure Brennan's contempt. Today would be no different, even if the stakes were higher than they'd ever been. Brennan's office was Spartan, regulation furniture, topographic maps on the walls, and a desk that held exactly 3 items: a computer, a coffee cup, and a photograph of him receiving a commendation from a 2-star general. He closed the door with controlled precision and turned to face her. "What the hell is this?" He held up a printed copy of her report, his knuckles white from gripping it too tightly. "It's a threat assessment, Sergeant Major. Based on intelligence patterns that suggest. Based on some program you developed without authorization, using methodology that hasn't been vetted or approved by anyone in the intelligence community." He threw the report on his desk. "Do you have any idea how many regulations you've violated? You're running unauthorized intelligence operations using military resources for personal projects." "Personal projects?" Irene's voice rose despite her best efforts to remain calm. "Sergeant Major, this is about protecting this base. The data clearly shows. The data shows that you've once again let your emotions override your judgment. You see threats everywhere because you're afraid. You predict attacks because you can't handle the uncertainty of military operations. And now you've wasted everyone's time with this fantasy of a coordinated assault based on your feelings about communication patterns. It's not feelings." The words burst out of Irene before she could stop them, her accent thickening with passion. "It's analysis. It's correlation. It's the same methodology that's prevented 3 previous attacks, but nobody wants to acknowledge that because admitting I was right would mean admitting that emotion and intuition have value in intelligence work." Brennan's face turned red. "Lieutenant Hill, you are dangerously close to insubordination. Your job is to translate communications and file reports through proper channels. Your job is not to develop rogue algorithms, make strategic predictions, or question the judgment of officers who have decades more experience than you. My job is to keep soldiers alive." Irene was fully committed now, the dam of 3 years' frustration finally breaking. "My job is to see patterns that others miss and sound the alarm when danger is coming. And if that makes me too emotional, if caring about whether my colleagues survive makes me unfit for service, then maybe this organization needs to reconsider its definition of fitness." The silence that followed was arctic. Brennan stared at her with an expression that mixed fury with something that might have been satisfaction, as if she'd finally given him the excuse he'd been waiting for. "You're relieved of duty pending a disciplinary review," he said quietly, the words hitting like hammer blows. "Report to your quarters and remain there until further notice. And Hill? This stunt just ended your military career." Irene left his office with her head high, but her hands were shaking. She'd finally said everything she'd been holding back for 3 years, and it had cost her everything. As she walked through the base toward her quarters, she passed soldiers who'd worked with her, who'd benefited from her analysis, who'd privately told her she was the best intelligence officer on base. None of them met her eyes. Back in her quarters, Irene sat on her bunk and stared at her laptop where the Sentinel algorithm was still running, still showing the threat assessment in stark red warnings. She'd been silenced, but the danger hadn't disappeared. Somewhere out there, enemy forces were moving into position. And in 36 hours, if her analysis was correct, they would attack a base full of soldiers who had no idea what was coming. She thought about Private Danny Webb's photograph on the memorial wall. Thought about all the other photographs that might join his because she'd failed to make anyone listen. 3 years of proving herself hadn't been enough. 3 years of being right hadn't mattered. Because at the end of the day, they saw an emotional young woman instead of a brilliant analyst. Irene opened her laptop and began typing a new document. If official channels wouldn't listen, maybe unofficial ones would. She started compiling evidence, building a case so comprehensive and irrefutable that even Brennan couldn't dismiss it. She had 36 hours to save a base full of people who'd never believed in her. Time to prove that emotion and excellence weren't mutually exclusive. Time to show them that the heart they'd called a weakness was actually her greatest strength. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for 1400 hours, exactly 30 hours before Irene's algorithm predicted the attack would begin. She sat in her quarters, watching the Sentinel program update in real time, each new data point confirming her initial assessment. The enemy was moving into position, communication patterns intensifying, supply movements accelerating. Everything pointed to an imminent large-scale assault. Captain Elena Frost knocked on her door at noon, entering with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that mixed sympathy with frustration. "I heard what happened with Brennan," she said, handing Irene one of the cups. "Half the intelligence division thinks he's gone too far this time." "Thinking it and saying it are different things," Irene replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Nobody's going to risk their career defending me, Elena." "I understand that." Elena sat down on the only chair in the small room, studying Irene carefully. "Show me your analysis. The real one, not the sanitized version you submitted through channels." For the next hour, Irene walked Elena through the Sentinel algorithm, explaining how it synthesized multiple intelligence streams into predictive models. She showed the communication intercepts she'd translated, the supply movement patterns she'd tracked, the historical attack data that supported her conclusions. Elena asked sharp questions, probing for weaknesses in the methodology, but Irene had answers for everything. "This is extraordinary work," Elena finally said, her voice quiet with something approaching awe. "Irene, this isn't just good analysis. This is revolutionary. The algorithm alone could change how we approach intelligence gathering." "It doesn't matter if nobody will look at it," Irene said bitterly. "Brennan's already decided I'm a hysterical woman seeing threats that don't exist. The disciplinary hearing is just theater." Elena stood up, her decision made. "Then we need to make sure the right people see this before that hearing. Colonel Hendricks has been asking questions about you for months. I think he's been building his own assessment." "The base commander?" Irene felt a flicker of hope, quickly suppressed. "Elena, Hendricks works closely with Brennan. He's not going to go against his sergeant major based on my work." "Maybe not," Elena agreed. "But he's also not an idiot. And he cares more about protecting this base than protecting Brennan's ego." She headed for the door, then turned back. "Get your analysis ready for presentation. Make it airtight. Because if I can get you in front of Hendricks, you'll have exactly one chance to convince him you're right." After Elena left, Irene spent the next 2 hours refining her presentation. She stripped away anything that could be interpreted as emotional appeal, focusing purely on data, correlations, and probability calculations. The algorithm predicted an 87% likelihood of attack within the specified time frame. By any standard, that warranted serious consideration. At 13:30, 30 minutes before her disciplinary hearing, Elena returned with unexpected news. "Hendricks wants to see you. Now." In his private office, not the hearing room. Irene grabbed her laptop and followed Elena through the base, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. This was either her salvation or the final nail in her career's coffin. They reached the administration building where Colonel Hendricks maintained his office, and Elena knocked on the heavy wooden door. "Enter," came the response. Irene stepped inside to find Colonel Hendricks sitting behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. Sergeant Major Brennan stood beside the window, his expression thunderous. And in the corner, Barely visible in the afternoon shadows, sat a figure in a uniform that made Irene's breath catch. The stars on his shoulder boards caught the light. 4 of them. A 4-star general was sitting in Colonel Hendrix's office. And Irene Hill, the too emotional lieutenant who was about to be court-martialed, had just walked into a room where her entire future would be decided by people who'd already made up their minds about her. "Lieutenant Hill," Colonel Hendrix said, his voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming. I believe you know Sergeant Major Brennan. This is General Lawrence Ashford, Supreme Allied Commander for European Operations. He's here conducting a routine inspection of forward operating bases." General Ashford stood, and Irene snapped to attention, rendering the sharpest salute of her life. The general returned it with casual precision, his weathered face unreadable. He was perhaps 60, with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. "At ease, Lieutenant. Colonel Hendrix tells me you've developed some concerns about base security." Irene shot a glance at Brennan, whose jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscles jumping. Whatever was happening here, he clearly hadn't expected it. "Yes, sir," she said carefully. "I've identified patterns in enemy communications and movements that suggest an imminent threat. The same patterns that Sergeant Major Brennan has dismissed as speculative and emotionally driven," Ashford said mildly. "It wasn't a question. I've read his assessment of your work, Lieutenant. He suggests that your analysis is compromised by an inability to separate personal feelings from objective intelligence gathering." Irene felt her stomach drop. If the general had already read Brennan's evaluation, this meeting was just a formality before they ended her career. "Sir, I respectfully disagree with that assessment." "I'm sure you do," Ashford said. "Which is why I'd like you to walk me through your analysis. From the beginning. Leave nothing out, and don't soften anything for my benefit. I want to understand exactly what you're seeing and how you're seeing it." For the next 45 minutes, Irene presented her findings. She pulled up the Sentinel algorithm on her laptop, displayed the communication intercepts, showed the correlation patterns, and explained the methodology behind her predictions. General Ashford asked questions that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of intelligence work, probing the assumptions underlying her analysis. Brennan tried to interject twice, but Ashford silenced him with a raised hand. "You'll have your turn, Sergeant Major. Right now, I want to hear from Lieutenant Hill." When Irene finished, the room fell silent. Ashford studied the laptop screen, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he turned to Brennan. "Sergeant Major, you've characterized this analysis as emotional speculation. Having reviewed it myself, I'm curious what specific elements you find lacking in rigor." Brennan straightened, clearly confident in his position. "Sir, the algorithm itself hasn't been vetted through proper channels. The lieutenant developed it independently, without authorization or oversight. We have no way of validating its accuracy. Except for the 3 previous attacks it predicted correctly," Hendrix interjected quietly. "Attacks that we prevented because Hill's warnings gave us time to adjust our security posture." Brennan's face darkened. "Those were fortunate coincidences, sir. Intelligence work requires more than lucky guesses." "Walk me through one of those coincidences," Ashford said. "Pick any of the 3. "Sir, I don't have the details readily available." "I do," Irene said quietly. She pulled up archive data from 4 months earlier. September 17th. My analysis indicated a probable ambush along Supply Route 3 between 0900 and 1100 hours. Sergeant Major Brennan dismissed it as emotional overreaction. Captain Frost delayed the supply convoy by 3 hours based on my private warning. At 10:15, enemy forces opened fire on the empty road where our convoy would have been. The room went very quiet. Ashford turned to Brennan. "Is this accurate, Sergeant Major?" "The lieutenant has a tendency to claim credit for operational decisions made by qualified officers," Brennan said stiffly. "Captain Frost delayed the convoy based on multiple intelligence sources." "I was the only source," Elena's voice came from the doorway. She must have been waiting outside, listening. I delayed that convoy because Hill convinced me her analysis was solid. Sergeant Major Brennan ordered me to proceed on schedule. I disobeyed that order because I trusted Hill's judgment more than his. Brennan's composure cracked. Captain Frost, you're out of line. No, Sergeant Major, General Ashford said quietly. I think she's exactly where she needs to be. He turned back to Irene. Lieutenant Hill, your algorithm predicts an attack on this base within, he checked his watch, 28 hours. What's your confidence level? 87%, sir, Irene replied. And climbing with each new data point. Ashford nodded slowly. Colonel Hendricks, what's your assessment? Sir, I've been reviewing Lieutenant Hill's work for 6 months, Hendricks said. Everything Sergeant Major Brennan calls emotional or speculative has proven accurate. Everything he's dismissed as coincidence has saved lives. My assessment is that we have an officer whose analytical methods are unconventional but extraordinarily effective, and we've been wasting her potential because she doesn't fit our preconceptions about what an intelligence analyst should look like. The words hung in the air like thunder. General Ashford stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the base below. Soldiers moved through their daily routines, unaware that their lives might depend on the decision being made in this room. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of command experience. Sergeant Major Brennan, I've read your file on Lieutenant Hill. 23 separate disciplinary notes over 3 years, all relating to the same issue, excessive emotional involvement in her work. You've characterized her as a liability, someone whose passion compromises her judgment. He turned to face them. But I've also read the operational reports that show this base's security posture has improved significantly since she arrived. The question is whether those improvements happen despite her methods or because of them. Brennan's expression was rigid. Sir, with respect, military intelligence requires objectivity. Personal feelings have no place in threat assessment. Lieutenant Hill has repeatedly demonstrated an inability to separate her emotional responses from analytical judgment. Give me an example, Ashford said. Sir, every report she files includes sections about human cost. She personalizes threats, talks about the soldiers who might die if we don't act. That's not intelligence analysis, that's emotional manipulation. Or, Colonel Hendricks interjected, it's an analyst who understands that intelligence work isn't abstract. That real people die when we get it wrong. Irene listened to them debate her worth as if she weren't in the room. It was familiar territory, this space where men discussed whether her passion disqualified her from doing the work she excelled at. But something was different this time. General Ashford wasn't dismissing her. He was asking questions, probing assumptions, challenging the narrative that Brennan had built around her. Lieutenant Hill, Ashford said suddenly. Why do you include human cost assessments in your intelligence reports? The room fell silent, waiting for her answer. Irene could feel Brennan's contempt, Hendricks's curiosity, Elena's support. But it was the general's steady gaze that held her attention, not challenging, not dismissive, but genuinely interested in her answer. Sir, because intelligence isn't just about identifying threats. It's about helping commanders understand the consequences of action and inaction. When I analyze a potential attack, I'm not just looking at tactical data. I'm thinking about the soldiers who will be in the line of fire, the families who will receive notifications, the operational impact of casualties. Her voice steadied as she spoke. Yes, that's emotional. But it's also what makes my analysis better. Because I never forget that behind every data point is a human being whose life has value. That's exactly the problem, Brennan snapped. Intelligence officers who get emotionally attached to their subjects make poor decisions. They see threats where none exist because they're afraid of missing something. They overreact because they can't handle the psychological pressure. And yet, Ashford said mildly, Lieutenant Hill's track record shows remarkably accurate threat assessment. If emotion compromises judgment, why is she right so often? The question hung in the air. Brennan had no answer that wouldn't undermine his entire argument. If Irene was too emotional to be effective, how had she become one of the most accurate intelligence analysts on the base? Sir, Irene said quietly. May I show you something? At Ashford's nod, she pulled up a different file on her laptop. This is Private Danny Webb. He died 3 months ago in an ambush on Route 7. I predicted that ambush. I submitted a threat assessment 2 weeks before it happened, flagging the exact location as high risk. Sergeant Major Brennan rejected my analysis as speculative. She pulled up another file. Corporal Sarah Mitchell, killed in a mortar attack on the eastern perimeter. I identified the attack pattern 4 days before it happened. My warning was dismissed. Another file. Sergeant Paul Anderson, died evacuating wounded soldiers after an IED explosion. I marked that route as compromised 72 hours before the attack. Irene looked up from the laptop, her eyes meeting Ashford's directly. Sir, you asked why I include human cost in my assessments. It's because I remember every face, every name, every soldier who died because someone decided my analysis was too emotional to trust. Yes, I care. Yes, I feel things deeply. But that's not a weakness, it's why I work harder, dig deeper, and refuse to stop until I find the threats that others miss. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Brennan seemed momentarily speechless. General Ashford walked slowly back to his chair and sat down, his expression thoughtful. Colonel Hendricks, he said finally. If Lieutenant Hill's prediction is accurate, and this base comes under attack in 28 hours, what's our current defensive posture? Inadequate, sir, Hendricks admitted. We have a scheduled patrol that will draw away 40% of our combat strength. If an attack comes while they're deployed, we'll be vulnerable. And if we cancel the patrol based on Hill's analysis and no attack materializes? We waste resources and undermine confidence in our intelligence gathering. Ashford nodded slowly. So we're faced with a choice. Trust the conventional assessment that sees no imminent threat, or trust an unconventional analyst whose methods we question but whose results we can't deny. General Ashford stood, his decision made. Colonel Hendricks, cancel the scheduled patrol. Increase base security to threaten Charlie. I want every defensive position manned and ready by 2200 hours tonight. If Lieutenant Hill is wrong, I'll take responsibility for the operational disruption. Sir, Brennan protested, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. You're making a major operational decision based on unverified intelligence from an analyst who's under disciplinary review. No, Sergeant Major, Ashford interrupted. I'm making a decision based on an analyst who's been right every time our warnings have been heeded and whose predictions have proven accurate when we've had the sense to listen. The disciplinary review, by the way, is cancelled. Brennan's face turned red. Sir, with respect, Lieutenant Hill has violated multiple regulations. She developed an unauthorized intelligence system, conducted analysis outside her assigned duties, and showed blatant disrespect for the chain of command. She showed initiative, Ashford corrected. She identified gaps in our intelligence capabilities and filled them using her own time and expertise. And yes, she got frustrated when repeatedly dismissed by a superior officer who seems more interested in maintaining conventional protocols than protecting soldiers' lives. He turned to Irene. Lieutenant Hill, I'm promoting you to captain, effective immediately. You'll report directly to Colonel Hendricks and head up a new intelligence analysis division. Your Sentinel algorithm will be reviewed by experts at UCOM headquarters, and if it proves as effective as your track record suggests, we'll implement it across all forward operating bases. Irene felt dizzy. 20 minutes ago, she'd been facing the end of her military career. Now she was being promoted and vindicated by a 4-star general. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Ashford said. Because you care too much to fail. He turned back to Brennan, his expression hardening. Sergeant Major, you're relieved of operational duties pending an investigation into your handling of intelligence reports. Specifically, I want to understand why multiple warnings from an analyst with a proven track record were systematically dismissed. Brennan's jaw clenched. Sir, I made those decisions based on my best judgment and 28 years of experience. Your best judgment got soldiers killed, Hendricks said quietly. The words fell like stones into still water. Danny Webb, Sarah Mitchell, Paul Anderson. They died because you were more concerned with maintaining authority than evaluating intelligence objectively. For the first time since Irene had known him, Sergeant Major Brennan looked uncertain. The absolute confidence that had defined his leadership style cracked, revealing something that might have been doubt or fear. Sir, those were combat deaths. They happen in war zones. They were preventable deaths, Irene said softly. They happened because my warnings were dismissed as emotional overreaction rather than evaluated on their merits. They happened because this organization values conformity over competence. Ashford nodded. Which is why things are going to change. Lieutenant, Captain Hill, I want you to prepare a comprehensive briefing on your analytical methods. When this situation resolves, you'll present it to my staff at headquarters. We're going to examine how unconscious bias affects our intelligence gathering and what we can do to ensure we don't lose critical insights because they come from unconventional sources. Elena stepped forward from her position near the door. Sir, if I may, Captain Hill will need support staff for her new division. I'd like to volunteer for the assignment. Approved, Ashford said. Anyone else who's been working with Captain Hill's analysis should consider joining her team. This is going to become the model for forward-deployed intelligence operations. As the meeting concluded and people began to file out, Brennan approached Irene. His expression was complex, anger, resentment, but also something that might have been grudging respect. You got what you wanted, Hill. I hope you're ready for what comes with it. What comes with it is responsibility for keeping soldiers alive, Irene replied. I've always been ready for that, Sergeant Major. The question is whether this organization was ready to let me try. Brennan left without responding, his shoulders stiff with wounded pride. Colonel Hendricks waited until they were alone before speaking. Captain Hill, you understand that you've just made powerful enemies. Not everyone is going to appreciate a junior officer proving that conventional wisdom was wrong. I understand, sir, Irene said. But I'd rather be right and unpopular than wrong and well-liked. Too many people have died already because I couldn't make anyone listen. Hendricks smiled slightly. General Ashford listens. That's why he's here. He's been tracking our base's improved security metrics and wondered why we were performing better than other FOBs. When he saw your name kept appearing in successful operations, he decided to investigate personally. Irene felt a rush of validation so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Someone had noticed. Someone had been paying attention all along. What happens now, sir? Now, Hendricks said, you prove that your algorithm is as good as you say it is. Because in 26 hours, we'll know whether you just saved this base or caused the biggest false alarm in recent military history. The next 24 hours transformed forward operating Base Sentinel into a fortress. Captain Irene Hill, she still couldn't quite believe the promotion, worked alongside Colonel Hendricks and the operations staff to position defensive assets according to her threat assessment. The Sentinel algorithm continued updating in real time, refining its predictions as new intelligence flowed in. By midnight, guard towers were fully manned, perimeter defenses reinforced, and quick reaction forces staged at strategic positions around the base. The cancelled patrol had freed up 40% more combat power. Soldiers who would have been exposed on the roads now stood ready to defend their home base. General Ashford remained at Sentinel, postponing his inspection tour to observe how the situation developed. Irene worked through the night in the operations center, her eyes burning from exhaustion but her mind sharp with focus. Elena brought her coffee at regular intervals, and together they monitored the intelligence feeds that painted an increasingly concerning picture. Enemy communications had gone silent 3 hours earlier, a tactical indicator that often preceded major operations. They're observing radio discipline, Irene explained to the assembled officers during the 0300 briefing. It's what I do before launching an attack. Cut all unnecessary communications to avoid detection, rely on pre-established plans and timing. Or they've abandoned whatever operation they were planning, offered Major Phillips, the base's operations officer who'd been skeptical of Irene's promotion. Radio silence could mean they're standing down. Not with these movement patterns. Irene pulled up satellite imagery showing vehicle tracks in the surrounding terrain. These are recent, within the last 6 hours. Multiple elements converging on positions that offer clear lines of attack on our perimeter. They haven't abandoned anything, they're getting into position for dawn. General Ashford studied the imagery carefully. Captain Hill, I need your best estimate. When do you expect the attack to begin? Irene checked her algorithm's latest projection. Sir, based on current data, between 0530 and 0615. Dawn attack gives them optimal visibility while our night vision advantage diminishes. The sun will be behind them, in our eyes. It's textbook assault timing. Then we have 2 hours to finalize preparations, Ashford said. Colonel Hendricks, I want every soldier at their positions by 0500. Captain Hill, you'll remain in the operations center and provide real-time analysis as the situation develops. If this attack materializes, I want to know what they're doing before they do it. As the briefing dispersed, Major Phillips lingered near Irene's workstation. Captain, for what it's worth, I hope you're right about this. But I also hope you're wrong, if you understand what I mean. Irene did understand. Being right meant soldiers would be in danger. Being wrong meant embarrassment and ammunition for her critics. There was no winning scenario, only degrees of loss. I hope I'm wrong too, sir. But I don't think I am. The hour before dawn stretched like taffy, each minute feeling like 10. Irene monitored every sensor, every camera, every intelligence feed. The base was silent in that peculiar way that military installations get before violence, a held breath, a coiled spring waiting to release. Soldiers stood at their posts, weapons ready, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the perimeter lights. At 0523, the first mortar round screamed out of the darkness and exploded inside the base perimeter. Irene had been right. The attack had begun. Chaos erupted in the operations center as reports flooded in from multiple sectors. Mortar rounds falling in a coordinated pattern, small arms fire from the northern perimeter, possible vehicle movement to the east. The enemy had planned well, a multi-axis attack designed to overwhelm defensive responses. But forward operating base Sentinel wasn't caught by surprise. Thanks to Irene's warning, every defensive position was manned and ready. Counter-battery radar immediately located the mortar positions, and friendly artillery responded within seconds. The quick reaction forces deployed exactly where Irene's analysis had predicted the main assault would come. Northern perimeter is taking heavy contact, reported the tactical operations officer. Estimated enemy strength 40 to 50 fighters, attempting to breach the wire. Eastern sector reporting vehicle movement, added another voice. Could be a flanking maneuver or secondary assault. Irene studied the pattern of attacks on her display, comparing them to the predictions her algorithm had generated. Sir, she called to Colonel Hendricks, the eastern movement is a feint. The real secondary assault will come from the south in approximately 3 minutes. They're trying to draw our reserves north while they punch through our weakest sector. Hendricks didn't hesitate. Redirect QRF-2 to southern perimeter. Heavy weapons teams, shift fire priorities to cover the southern approach. Major Phillips stared at Irene. How can you possibly know that? Because it's what their communication patterns suggested yesterday, Irene replied, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she pulled up archived intercepts. They discussed a multi-stage assault with a diversionary element. The eastern movement matches the signature of their diversionary tactics. The south is where they'll commit their main force. 3 minutes later, exactly as predicted, enemy fighters emerged from concealed positions south of the base and rushed the perimeter. They ran directly into prepared defensive positions that tore their assault apart before it could gain momentum. The battle lasted 47 minutes. From her position in the operations center, Irene coordinated intelligence support while the base's defenders turned back wave after wave of attackers. Her algorithm continued processing data in real time, identifying patterns in the enemy's tactics and predicting their next moves with uncanny accuracy. "They're preparing to withdraw," she announced at 0610, watching communication intercepts spike suddenly after maintaining radio silence. "Command elements are calling for a retreat. They've realized the surprise is gone and they're taking unsustainable casualties." Colonel Hendricks authorized pursuit operations, and within minutes, helicopters and ground forces were chasing the retreating enemy fighters into the surrounding terrain. The attack that should have devastated forward operating base Sentinel had instead become a decisive defensive victory, with minimal friendly casualties and significant enemy losses. As the sun rose fully over the mountains, painting the base in golden light, the extent of what had almost happened became clear. Impact craters from mortar rounds dotted the compound. Bullet holes scarred walls and equipment. But the defensive preparations based on Irene's warning had positioned personnel and critical assets away from the most heavily targeted areas. What would have been a massacre had become a manageable engagement. General Ashford emerged from the command bunker where he'd observed the battle, his uniform dusty but his bearing unchanged. He found Irene still at her workstation, updating her analysis for the after-action report. "Captain Hill, walk with me." They toured the base together as damage assessment teams cataloged the destruction and soldiers began repair operations. Ashford pointed to a barracks building that had taken 3 direct mortar hits. "That building was evacuated last night based on your threat assessment. 43 soldiers were sleeping there. They would have been sleeping there when those rounds hit." Irene looked at the shattered structure, at the beds visible through the collapsed walls, and felt something twist in her chest. 43 faces she wouldn't have to add to the memorial wall. 43 families who wouldn't receive the notification she'd been dreading. "Sir, I was just doing my job." "No, Captain. You were doing everyone else's job too, apparently." Ashford stopped near the memorial wall where Private Danny Webb's photograph still hung. "I spoke with Sergeant Major Brennan this morning. He's requested transfer to a non-operational position. I approved it." Irene absorbed this news quietly. Part of her felt vindicated. Brennan's dismissal of her work had nearly cost dozens of lives. But another part, the emotional part that everyone criticized, felt sympathy for a soldier whose entire worldview had been proven catastrophically wrong. "What will happen to him, sir?" "He'll finish his career in a training role where his experience has value but his judgment won't risk lives," Ashford replied. "And before you feel too sorry for him, remember that his pride cost soldiers their lives. Danny Webb might be alive if Brennan had listened to your warnings 3 months ago." They continued walking, passing soldiers who saluted General Ashford but whose eyes lingered on Irene with new respect. Word had spread quickly through the base about how Captain Hill's analysis had saved them all. The too emotional lieutenant who'd been dismissed and marginalized was suddenly the hero who'd predicted everything. "You know what's going to happen now," Ashford said as they reached the base commander's building. "This victory is going to generate reports, analysis, and scrutiny. Some people will celebrate your methods. Others will claim you got lucky. And many will try to replicate your success without understanding what made it possible. The algorithm is replicable, sir," Irene offered. "The methodology can be taught." "I'm not talking about the algorithm," Ashford interrupted. "I'm talking about the passion, the dedication, the refusal to accept conventional limitations. Those aren't things you can program or teach in a classroom. They're personal qualities that made you willing to risk your career because you knew you were right." He stopped and turned to face her directly. "In 2 hours, I'm conducting an awards ceremony for the soldiers who distinguished themselves during this engagement. You'll be receiving a Bronze Star for your actions. But more importantly, you'll be receiving something else." "Sir?" Irene asked, confused. "Recognition," Ashford said simply. "Public, official, undeniable recognition that your methods work, that your passion is an asset, and that this military is stronger when we embrace unconventional excellence rather than demanding conformity. What happened here today is going to change how we approach intelligence analysis across the entire theater of operations." As they entered the building, Irene caught her reflection in a window, dusty uniform, exhausted face, but eyes bright with purpose. She'd spent 3 years being told she was too emotional, too passionate, too unconventional to be effective. Now she'd proven that those supposedly disqualifying traits were exactly what made her exceptional. The ceremony was scheduled for 1400 hours, giving everyone time to recover from the battle and begin processing what had happened. Irene returned to her quarters for the first time in 30 hours, intending to shower and change into a fresh uniform. Instead, she found herself standing in front of her mirror, staring at the captain's bars that now adorned her collar. 3 years ago, she'd arrived at Forward Operating Base Sentinel full of hope and determination, ready to serve and make a difference. The military had systematically tried to diminish that hope, to grind down her determination, to force her into a narrow box labeled acceptable. But she'd refused to fit. And now, finally, the box was being rebuilt around her true shape. The ceremony took place on the base parade ground under clear afternoon skies. Every soldier not actively engaged in security operations assembled in formation, their dress uniforms crisp despite the lingering damage visible throughout the base. General Ashford stood on a raised platform alongside Colonel Hendricks and the base command staff. Conspicuously absent was Sergeant Major Brennan, who'd officially requested immediate transfer that morning. Irene stood in the front row with other soldiers being recognized for their actions during the battle. Her hands were steady now, the adrenaline and exhaustion replaced by a strange calm. She prepared a brief speech in case she was asked to say something, but mostly she just wanted this moment to be over so she could return to work. There was still analysis to complete, after-action reports to file, improvements to identify for next time. General Ashford began the ceremony with remarks about the battle and the courage shown by Sentinel's defenders. He spoke about preparation, vigilance, and the importance of trusting expertise regardless of where it came from. Then he began presenting awards, working through commendations for soldiers who'd manned defensive positions, for medics who'd treated wounded under fire, for quick reaction forces who'd repelled the assault. Finally, he called Irene's name. Captain Irene Hill, front and center. Irene marched forward with practiced precision, her boots striking the platform in perfect rhythm. She came to attention before General Ashford, saluting sharply. He returned the salute and began reading from the citation for her Bronze Star, his voice carrying across the assembled formation. For exceptionally meritorious service in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. Captain Hill demonstrated extraordinary analytical capability and personal courage in identifying and assessing a credible threat to Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Despite facing significant institutional resistance, Captain Hill persisted in her analysis, developing innovative intelligence-gathering methods that proved crucial in preparing defensive operations. Her actions directly contributed to saving numerous lives and securing a decisive defensive victory. Captain Hill's dedication to excellence and unwavering commitment to protecting her fellow soldiers reflect great credit upon herself and the United States Armed Forces. As Ashford pinned the Bronze Star to her uniform, the assembled soldiers erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite, measured applause typical of military ceremonies. It was genuine, enthusiastic recognition from people who understood that they were alive because of her work. Irene felt tears threatening and forced them back. Not here. Not now. She could be emotional later, in private. But then something unexpected happened. From the back of the formation, someone began to chant, "Hill! Hill! Hill!" Others picked it up, the sound growing until hundreds of voices were shouting her name in unison. The formal military ceremony dissolved into something rawer, more honest. These were soldiers celebrating one of their own who'd saved their lives. General Ashford let it continue for several seconds before raising his hand for silence. When the parade ground quieted, he spoke again, his voice solemn. Captain Hill's story raises important questions about how we evaluate talent and potential in our armed forces. For 3 years, this officer's capabilities were systematically underestimated and dismissed. Not because her work was inadequate, but because she didn't fit conventional expectations about how an intelligence analyst should behave. He paused, letting the words sink in. She was called too emotional. Too passionate. Too unconventional. And yet, when this base faced its greatest test, it was her emotion, her passion, and her unconventional methods that saved us all. This should make us deeply uncomfortable. It should force us to examine our biases and ask what other talent we're wasting because it doesn't conform to our preconceptions. Irene stood at attention, barely breathing as the general continued. This wasn't just recognition for her, it was a challenge to the entire system that had tried to diminish her. Effective immediately, Ashford announced, Captain Hill's Sentinel algorithm will be evaluated for implementation across all forward operating bases in this theater. Furthermore, I'm establishing a new training program focused on developing unconventional intelligence analysts, people who think differently, who approach problems from unexpected angles, who refuse to accept that something can't be done simply because it hasn't been done before. The applause returned, but Ashford raised his hand once more. Captain Hill, you've proven your methods work. Now comes the harder task, teaching others not just how to replicate your analysis, but how to cultivate the courage to trust their insights even when conventional wisdom says they're wrong. Are you prepared for that responsibility? Irene's voice was steady when she replied. Yes, sir. I am. Excellent. Then I have one more presentation to make. Ashford turned to an aide who approached carrying a small wooden box. The general opened it to reveal a command pin, the insignia worn by officers given leadership of critical units. Captain Hill, you are hereby appointed commander of the Forward Intelligence Analysis Cell, reporting directly to theater headquarters. You'll have the resources and authority to develop your methodology into a standardized program while maintaining operational responsibility for this sector's threat assessment. Irene accepted the pin with hands that trembled slightly despite her best efforts. Command. Real command, not just recognition. She was being given the authority and resources to transform her work from personal achievement into institutional capability. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Ashford said. Then he did something extraordinary. He stepped back and rendered her a salute, a 4-star general saluting a newly promoted captain in front of hundreds of assembled soldiers. The gesture sent shockwaves through the formation. Military protocol dictated that junior officers saluted senior officers, not the reverse. By saluting Irene, General Ashford was making a statement that transcended rank structure. He was acknowledging that true leadership and value weren't determined by position or conventional measures of success. Irene returned the salute, her eyes locked with Ashford's, and in that moment understood the full weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every soldier who'd been dismissed or underestimated, every unconventional thinker who'd been forced into conformity, every passionate person who'd been told their emotions were weaknesses. As the formation dispersed after the ceremony, Irene found herself surrounded by soldiers wanting to congratulate her or thank her personally. She shook hands until her arm ached, accepted praise that still felt surreal, and tried to process the magnitude of how completely her situation had transformed in less than 48 hours. Elena fought through the crowd to reach her, pulling Irene into an embrace that violated military decorum but perfectly captured the moment. You did it, Elena whispered. You actually did it. We did it, Irene corrected. You backed me when nobody else would. You delayed that convoy in September. You brought me to Colonel Hendricks yesterday. None of this happens without you. And none of those soldiers are alive without you, Elena replied, releasing her. So accept the recognition with grace, Commander Hill. Commander Hill. The title still felt impossible. 3 days ago, she'd been facing court-martial. Now she commanded a new intelligence division with theater-wide responsibilities. The velocity of change was dizzying. Major Phillips approached, looking uncomfortable but determined. Captain, Commander Hill, I owe you an apology. I dismissed your analysis as speculative, and I was wrong. Your work saved my life and the lives of my soldiers. Thank you. Others followed with similar sentiments. Soldiers who'd worked alongside her for years but never really seen her were suddenly treating her with respect that felt both validating and bittersweet. Why had it taken a battle and a general's intervention for them to recognize capabilities she'd demonstrated consistently for 3 years? As the crowd thinned, Colonel Hendricks appeared at her elbow. "Walk with me, Commander." They strolled through the base as repair crews worked to fix battle damage and life slowly returned to normal routines. Hendricks walked in silence for several minutes before speaking. "You understand that this recognition comes with a target on your back. There are officers throughout the command structure who'll resent your promotion, who'll see you as a threat to conventional military culture." "I understand, sir," Irene replied. "But I didn't join the military to be popular. I joined to serve and protect." "Good answer," Hendricks said. "But here's what you need to know. General Ashford protected you yesterday because your results were undeniable. Going forward, you'll need to maintain that standard. One significant failure, and your critics will pounce. The price of being unconventional is that you don't get second chances." The words were sobering but fair. Irene had proven her methods worked, but she'd have to keep proving it every single day. "Sir, I'd rather succeed under scrutiny than fail under protection. At least now I'll have the opportunity to show what's possible." They reached the memorial wall where Private Danny Webb's photograph hung alongside others who'd fallen in recent months. Hendricks stopped and gestured at the images. "These are the people you're fighting for. Not your career, not your reputation, but them. Remember that when the pressure builds and the critics get loud." "I will, sir," Irene promised, studying Webb's young face. He'd been 22 when he died, full of dreams and potential cut short because her warnings hadn't been heeded. "I'll remember all of them." As evening settled over the base, Irene finally returned to her quarters, now significantly upgraded to reflect her new command position. Someone had moved her belongings while she was at the ceremony, transferring her from the cramped junior officer housing to a small but private room with an actual desk and window. She sat at the desk and opened her laptop, pulling up the Sentinel algorithm that had changed everything. The program continued running, analyzing new intelligence, updating threat assessments, predicting patterns. It was good work, revolutionary work, even. But it was also just the beginning. Irene began drafting an outline for the training program General Ashford had mentioned. How do you teach people to trust their intuition while maintaining analytical rigor? How do you encourage emotional engagement without compromising objectivity? How do you identify unconventional thinkers in a system built to reward conformity? These were questions without easy answers, challenges that would define her new command. But they were also exactly the kind of problems she'd spent 3 years preparing to solve. Every dismissal, every criticism, every moment of isolation had been preparation for this opportunity to transform not just her own career, but the entire approach to military intelligence analysis. A knock at her door interrupted her planning. She opened it to find a young lieutenant she didn't recognize, barely 23 years old with nervous eyes and a folder clutched tightly to his chest. "Commander Hill," he asked hesitantly. "I'm Lieutenant James Patterson. I work in communications intercept. I heard about what you did, about the algorithm, about how you kept fighting even when nobody listened." He held out the folder. "I've been working on something too. A pattern recognition system for encrypted communications. My supervisor says it's a waste of time, that I should focus on my assigned duties. But I thought, maybe you'd look at it." Irene took the folder and saw herself 3 years ago, young, passionate, full of ideas that didn't fit conventional frameworks. She'd been given a chance by General Ashford. Now it was her turn to give chances to others. "Come in, Lieutenant. Show me what you've been working on." As Patterson eagerly explained his system, Irene realized this was what her new command really meant. Not just recognition for her own achievements, but the opportunity to identify and nurture other unconventional talents. To build a community where passion was valued, where emotion was recognized as a tool rather than a liability, where the next Irene Hill wouldn't have to fight alone for 3 years to be heard. The story that had begun with a young European woman being dismissed and marginalized was transforming into something larger, a movement to change how the military identified, developed, and utilized exceptional talent. And this time, when soldiers like Lieutenant Patterson brought forward innovative ideas, there would be someone who understood, someone who believed, someone who remembered what it felt like to be dismissed and was determined to ensure others didn't face the same barriers. 3 months after the attack on Forward Operating Base Sentinel, Commander Irene Hill stood in a conference room at European Command Headquarters, facing 30 senior intelligence officers from across the theater. Her Sentinel algorithm had been running at 6 different bases for 8 weeks, and the results were generating both excitement and controversy throughout the military intelligence community. "The data speaks for itself," Irene said, advancing to the next slide in her presentation. "Bases implementing the Sentinel system have seen a 43% improvement in threat prediction accuracy and a 67% reduction in surprise attacks. But the algorithm is only part of the solution. The real breakthrough is in how we're training analysts to interpret and act on the data." A colonel from the third row raised his hand. "Commander Hill, your methods emphasize emotional engagement with intelligence subjects. How do you prevent that emotional involvement from compromising analytical objectivity?" It was a question she'd answered dozens of times, but Irene never grew tired of addressing it. "Sir, the assumption that emotion compromises objectivity is itself flawed. Emotion makes us care about accuracy. It drives us to dig deeper, to question our assumptions, to keep working when conventional analysis says we're done. The key is teaching analysts to channel that passion into rigorous methodology rather than suppressing it entirely." She pulled up case studies from the 6 pilot bases, showing how analysts trained in her methods had identified threats that traditional approaches missed. Not because they had better data, but because they approached the data differently, looking for human patterns, psychological indicators, behavioral signatures that pure mathematical analysis couldn't capture. "The enemy isn't a collection of data points," Irene continued. "They're human beings with motivations, fears, and decision-making patterns. Understanding those human elements requires emotional intelligence, not just technical skill. We're teaching analysts to use empathy as an analytical tool." General Ashford, observing from the back of the room, smiled slightly. He'd been tracking Irene's progress closely, watching her transform from a marginalized lieutenant into a respected innovator. The resistance to her methods remained significant. Many senior officers couldn't reconcile unconventional approaches with military discipline, but results were impossible to ignore. After the briefing concluded, officers clustered around Irene with questions ranging from technical implementation details to broader philosophical concerns about military culture. She answered each question patiently, aware that every conversation was an opportunity to win another convert to her approach. Lieutenant Patterson, now officially assigned to her division, approached with a tablet displaying new data. "Commander, we've got another success story. The base in Poland just prevented an attack using the pattern recognition system we developed. They're calling it a textbook application of the Hill methodology." The Hill methodology. Irene still found it strange hearing her name attached to what she'd simply considered good analysis. But she understood the importance of branding, of creating a framework that others could reference and replicate. The Sentinel algorithm and the training program she developed were collectively becoming known as the Hill methodology, an approach to intelligence analysis that valued intuition alongside evidence, emotion alongside objectivity, unconventional thinking alongside rigorous discipline. That evening, Irene returned to her quarters at the headquarters complex and found a message waiting from an unexpected source. Sergeant Major Victor Brennan, now working in a training role at a stateside facility, had sent her an email. She opened it with mixed emotions. "Commander Hill," it began formally. "I've been following reports of your success with considerable interest. I owe you an apology that I should have offered months ago. My treatment of you was unprofessional and unjust. I allowed my preconceptions about proper military bearing to blind me to exceptional analytical capability. Soldiers died because I couldn't see past my own biases. I'm writing to say I was wrong, you were right, and I hope the Army learns from my mistakes as much as from your successes. I wish you continued success in your important work." Irene read the email twice, processing the unexpected contrition from a man who'd made her life miserable for 3 years. Part of her wanted to feel vindicated, to savor this admission of wrongdoing. But mostly she just felt tired. Brennan's apology didn't resurrect Private Danny Webb or the others who'd died because warnings went unheeded. It didn't undo years of dismissal and marginalization. But it did represent something important: acknowledgement that the system had been wrong, that change was necessary, that the military could evolve beyond outdated assumptions about who deserved to be heard. She composed a brief reply accepting his apology and suggesting he might contribute to developing better training methods for senior NCOs who supervised unconventional talents. A knock at her door revealed Elena, now promoted to major and serving as Irene's deputy commander. "Ready for tomorrow?" Elena asked, settling into the small couch near the window. Tomorrow was the big presentation. Irene would brief the Joint Chiefs of Staff via secure video conference, making the case for expanding the Hill methodology across all military branches. It was an opportunity to influence policy at the highest levels, but also a high-stakes moment where a single misstep could undermine everything she'd built. "I'm ready," Irene said with more confidence than she felt. "We have the data, we have the results, and we have the moral authority of lives saved. If they're willing to listen, we can change how the entire military approaches intelligence analysis." "And if they're not willing to listen?" Elena asked. Irene smiled, remembering the young lieutenant who'd climbed unauthorized onto a stage to challenge conventional wisdom. "Then we keep pushing until they have no choice but to hear us. That's what unconventional thinking means, refusing to accept that something can't be done just because it hasn't been done before." Part 12. The video conference with the Joint Chiefs began at 0800 sharp. Irene stood before the camera in her dress uniform, her command insignia gleaming, her bearing confident despite the magnitude of the audience. On screens around the conference room, the most senior military leaders in the United States watched with expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. For 45 minutes, she presented the evidence. Threat predictions compared to actual attacks. Lives saved through early warning. Operational effectiveness improvements at bases implementing her methodology. She spoke about the human cost of conventional thinking, about soldiers who died because their protectors couldn't see past institutional biases. Questions came hard and fast. How do you scale emotional intelligence training? How do you prevent the methodology from being diluted as it expands? How do you identify candidates who possess the right combination of passion and discipline? Irene answered each query with data, examples, and the calm authority of someone who'd lived every aspect of what she was proposing. Finally, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff spoke. "Commander Hill, your results are impressive. But I'm concerned about cultural resistance. Many senior leaders remain skeptical of approaches that emphasize emotion and intuition over traditional analytical frameworks. How do you address that resistance?" Irene thought about Sergeant Major Brennan, about 3 years of systematic dismissal, about the battle that had finally forced recognition. "Sir, cultural change never comes from the top demanding it. It comes from the bottom proving it works, repeatedly and undeniably, until resistance becomes unsustainable. We don't need every leader to embrace this methodology immediately. We need enough leaders willing to try it, and then we need time to demonstrate results that speak for themselves." The chairman nodded slowly. "Fair answer. General Ashford, you've observed Commander Hill's work firsthand. What's your assessment?" General Ashford leaned forward on his screen. "Sir, I've spent 38 years in uniform, and I've never seen an innovation with this much potential to save lives. Yes, it challenges conventional thinking. Yes, it makes some people uncomfortable. But discomfort is the price of progress. My recommendation is full implementation across UCOM, with pilot programs in other theaters." The discussion continued for another 20 minutes before the chairman called for a decision. The vote among the Joint Chiefs was unanimous: the Hill methodology would be expanded, with resources allocated for training, technology development, and cultural integration. Irene had won not just acceptance, but enthusiastic support from the highest levels of military leadership. As the video conference ended, General Ashford requested a private moment with Irene. When the others had cleared the room, he spoke with unusual candor. "Commander, you've accomplished something extraordinary. You've changed not just how we do intelligence analysis, but how we think about talent and potential. That's a legacy that will outlast any of us. Sir, I just wanted to keep soldiers alive, Irene replied. Everything else came from that. I know, Ashford said. That's what made it authentic. That's why people believed you when you said conventional wisdom was failing us. Because you weren't promoting a career, you were fighting for lives. 3 weeks later, Irene stood on a stage at Forward Operating Base Sentinel for a ceremony honoring the soldiers who'd defended the base during the attack. As she prepared to present medals to the defenders, she looked out at the assembled formation and saw faces that reflected her own journey, young soldiers full of potential, unconventional thinkers learning to trust their instincts, passionate individuals discovering that emotion could be strength rather than weakness. Before beginning the formal ceremony, she spoke from the heart. 6 months ago, I stood in this same place facing the end of my career because I refused to accept that caring too much was a disqualifying flaw. Today, I stand here as proof that the military can evolve, can recognize talent in unexpected forms, can value results over conformity. But this isn't my victory, it's ours. Every soldier who's ever been dismissed for being different, for thinking unconventionally, for refusing to fit the mold, this moment belongs to you too. As she presented medals and shook hands, Irene noticed a young sergeant standing slightly apart from the formation, clutching a folder with the desperate hope of someone who had an idea but no audience. She recognized that look, had worn it herself not so long ago. After the ceremony concluded, she approached the sergeant. I'm Commander Hill, she said, extending her hand. You look like someone who's been waiting for permission to be heard. You don't need permission anymore. Show me what you've been working on. The sergeant's eyes widened with gratitude and relief. Ma'am, I've been developing a predictive system for logistical vulnerabilities. My supply sergeant says it's outside my lane, but I think it could prevent. Show me, Irene interrupted gently. And then we'll figure out how to make it part of what we do here. As they walked toward the operations center, Irene reflected on the journey from dismissed lieutenant to respected commander. The military hadn't become perfect, institutional bias and conventional thinking still created barriers for unconventional talents. But change had begun, driven by undeniable results and leaders willing to question their assumptions. The sun set over Forward Operating Base Sentinel, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Somewhere in those mountains, threats still lurked, enemies still planned attacks, dangers still waited for soldiers who'd sworn to defend their countries. But now, thanks to a young European woman who'd refused to be silenced, those soldiers had better protection. Not just better technology or tactics, but a military culture beginning to recognize that strength comes in many forms, that passion can be an asset, and that the best way to honor those who serve is to actually listen when they speak. Irene Hill had proven that being too emotional wasn't a weakness, it was what made her care enough to be brilliant. And in doing so, she'd helped create a military that valued not just conventional excellence, but the unconventional courage to challenge assumptions, trust intuition, and fight for what's right even when the entire system says you're wrong. The story that began with a shove off a stage had become a testament to resilience, innovation, and the transformative power of refusing to accept limitations others tried to impose. And for every soldier who'd ever been told they were too different to succeed, Irene Hill's journey offered hope that someday, somehow, excellence would be recognized regardless of the form it took. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.